In the quiet residential area of Greenwich, Connecticut, among the neatly lined white colonial-style houses, Catherine's cheerful voice could be heard drifting from the second-floor window of the Brown residence. Just like any other day, she said, "Today I'll be sharing the recipe for my favorite lemon tart." Catherine Brown, 29, was the owner of Kathy's Kitchen, a cooking YouTube channel with 50,000 subscribers and a freelance web designer. Her smile in front of the camera had always captivated her viewers. However, recently, her posting frequency had noticeably decreased. Catherine was 5 months pregnant, and her morning sickness was getting worse by the day. Even the slightest smell from her beloved Sub-Zero refrigerator was enough to trigger severe nausea. "I'm sorry, I'm not feeling well again today," Catherine apologized to her viewers through the screen. They responded with kind words, comments like, "Don't push yourself," and "The baby comes first" flooded the screen. Her husband, David, was away on another business trip. At 34, he served as a research and development manager at a biotech company in Boston, spending half of each month away from home. This serious and hardworking husband had met Catherine at a social media marketing seminar 3 years ago, where they fell into a fateful romance. Now, in their second year of marriage, they were eagerly awaiting their new arrival. However, a shadow was creeping into their happy daily life. A year ago, David's mother had moved in with them. It all started with the sudden death of David's father, George, 2 years prior. On the surface, George had been known as a philanthropist and former executive at a pharmaceutical company, but after his death, a 35-year history of domestic violence and massive debts from company embezzlement came to light. To repay the debts, David's mother, Eleanor, had to end her teaching career and give up the house she had lived in for over 30 years. "Let's have Mother live with us." David's suggestion came from a place of kindness. However, no one could have predicted that this decision would expose the family's underlying tensions. Eleanor Brown, 62, had been a victim of domestic violence for over 30 years while maintaining the facade of a perfect housewife. While beloved by children as an elementary school teacher at home, she would overreact to minor issues and particularly despised modern social media culture. "Catherine, those videos of yours, they're rather undignified," Eleanor said, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. Preparing perfect breakfasts, maintaining immaculate cleanliness, and scrambling to repay debts, her rigid posture seemed to bear the weight of years of pressure. David had been strongly influenced by his mother. Having witnessed his alcoholic father's violence since childhood, he threw himself into work as if trying to escape those memories. The Browns appeared to be a harmonious family on the surface, but in reality, they were deeply troubled. The family photo displayed in their spacious living room showed smiling faces, but behind those smiles, everyone was carrying their own burdens. From Catherine's second-floor office window, she could see the Martha Stewart-inspired garden, the perfectly manicured lawn, and seasonal flower beds. The scene seemed to mirror their lives, outward beauty masking inner distortions. A quiet change had begun, unnoticed by anyone. It would soon create ripples that no one could have anticipated, until that peaceful spring afternoon when Catherine's scream pierced the air. At 7 a.m., Greenwich was still wrapped in tranquility. Outside the window, neighborhood housewives were enjoying their early morning jogs and starting their elegant days with Starbucks morning coffee. In stark contrast, tension was already brewing inside the Brown residence. Catherine woke up with severe nausea. Her steps were heavier than usual as she rushed to the bathroom. David was away on a 2-week business trip. He had been on the phone late last night, preparing for a research presentation in Boston. As she wiped her mouth with a towel, she found herself missing her husband's voice. "Are you all right? Breakfast is ready," Eleanor's voice echoed from downstairs. Having finished preparing a perfect breakfast, her mother-in-law was already standing in the kitchen, wearing an apron with crispy bacon, scrambled eggs, and freshly baked croissants. The aroma of American breakfast wafted throughout the house, but the smell made Catherine's stomach churn even more violently. "I'm sorry, I don't think I can eat this morning," Catherine said. Eleanor's hands froze for a moment at Catherine's words. A shadow fell across the perfectly arranged tableware. The high-end William Sonoma dining set had been Eleanor's wedding gift to them. "I see. Wasting food again," Eleanor replied briefly. After this response, she silently began clearing away one person's portion. Her back seemed to harbor an ominous portent of the tragedy to come. Later, during the morning, Catherine lay in bed, checking work emails on her smartphone. A web design deadline was approaching. However, just looking at the computer screen made her eyes strain. "Why don't you rest?" Eleanor's voice, bringing lunch, seemed kind at first glance. However, her eyes were cold, appraising Catherine like merchandise. "Thank you, but I'm fine," Catherine replied with a smile, quietly closing her bedroom door. Around 4 p.m., Catherine forced herself to get up. It was time for her regular Kathy's Kitchen broadcast. Realizing she couldn't manage filming the new recipe she had planned, she decided to do an apology live stream instead. "Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry, but I'm not feeling well today," Catherine explained her condition to viewers on her smartphone. Concerned comments began flooding in. "Take care. We'll watch when you're better." Such warm words brought her some comfort. That's when it happened. Suddenly, her bedroom door burst open. "You useless thing! Get up right now!" Eleanor stood there, still holding a hot iron. Her usually perfect hair and makeup were disheveled, and her eyes held an eerie light. With the dark hallway as her backdrop, her figure appeared like an ominous shadow. "I'm not feeling well." Catherine's voice trembled with fear. The live stream screen was flooded with surprised and concerned comments. "Shut up! I won't tolerate such a lazy daughter-in-law. You can't even handle housework or childcare properly, but you're always on social media. Shameless!" Eleanor's screams echoed through the room. Her hand, with the iron, slowly moved toward Catherine. The bluish steam was still rising from the iron. "Stop!" Catherine screamed, but Eleanor didn't stop. The hot iron pressed against Catherine's right arm. Intense pain and the smell of burning filled the room. Comments like "call the police" and "someone report this" continued to flow on the smartphone screen. "It hurts! The baby! The baby!" Catherine screamed. And at the mention of the baby, Eleanor's movement stopped for a moment. A flicker of confusion crossed her eyes, perhaps stirred by the word "baby." But soon, her eyes regained their coldness. "Liar! Lazy good-for-nothing!" "You're just like him." Eleanor's voice was shaking. She referred to her late husband, George. It was as if the memories of 35 years of violence were resurfacing within her. Her eyes were no longer seeing reality. She was likely seeing a scene overlapped with phantoms from the past. 5 minutes later, sirens approached. Someone in the neighborhood must have called after hearing the scream. Several residents had already gathered at the front door. Beyond the whitewood fence, people could be seen watching the situation, smartphones in hand. The gardening club members, usually exchanging only peaceful greetings, were now wrapped in unusual tension. "Police, open up!" At that voice, Eleanor's expression changed. The iron fell to the floor with a loud clang. The strange light had vanished from her eyes. Instead, they now held bottomless fear. George, forgive me." Eleanor's body crumpled. In that moment, you could see 35 years worth of mask shattering. The perfect housewife, ideal mother, respected teacher. All the masks were crumbling with a sound. Despite her pain, Catherine continued gripping her smartphone. On screen, witnessed by tens of thousands of viewers, a new family tragedy was being broadcast in real time. Everyone knew that from this day forward, the Brown family would change dramatically, and the chain of violence that had been hidden for so many years had finally surfaced. The sound of sirens echoed again through the quiet suburban streets of Greenwich. This time it was an ambulance. As the ambulance sirens faded into the distance, Several police cars and local news vans were already parked in front of the Brown residence. An unusual commotion spread through the quiet residential area in the early evening. "Mrs. Catherine Brown, let me check the condition of your burn." The paramedic carefully examined Catherine's arm. Fortunately, the burn was relatively minor. However, the medical staff's expressions were grave at the fact of assault against a pregnant woman. "We recommend a hospital examination to check the baby's condition." Catherine nodded silently. Beside her, a police officer was reviewing the smartphone footage. The live stream was already beginning to spread rapidly across social media. The hashtag #SaveCafe was trending in no time. Meanwhile, Eleanor was being questioned by the police, sitting on the luxury sofa in the living room. She had shrunk into herself, looking like a different person entirely. "For 35 years, I endured it all." A young female officer listened quietly to her trembling voice. In this perfectly maintained house, the long-hidden history of violence was slowly coming to light. "My husband did the same to me." Eleanor's confession came in fragments. Rolling up the sleeve of her brand-name cardigan, she revealed faint traces of old burn marks, signs of violence inflicted by her husband, George, 35 years ago. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" the officer asked. "I was ashamed. I couldn't tell anyone. As a teacher, as a mother, as a wife, I had to be perfect." At 8 p.m., David returned home in an emergency. He had interrupted his research presentation to come back. His expression, having rushed straight from the airport, showed a mix of confusion and anger. "Why did this happen?" David shouted as soon as he entered. His voice was filled more with anger than sadness. "Why did you do a live stream exposing our family's shame?" At first, he tried to defend his mother, the suffering he had witnessed since childhood, his father's violence, and his own inability to do anything. That guilt clouded his judgment. "David, that's not it," Catherine desperately tried to explain, but her husband's anger wouldn't subside. "You must share some responsibility for pushing Mother to this point." At that moment, a police officer quietly intervened. "We have footage of the assault on your wife. This is clearly a crime." At the calm voice, David's expression froze. The footage on the smartphone, the screams from his mother, his wife's cries, and in the background, comments from tens of thousands of viewers. Reality was slowly taking shape in his mind. "Let's get counseling," Catherine suggested quietly, and the room fell into silence. Late that night, the three sat on the living room sofa, cold coffee on the table, smiling family photos on the wall. The scene now looked painfully empty. Local news had already begun breaking coverage of the incident. DV incident against notable cooking YouTuber. Social media visualized the cycle of violence. Headlines danced across the screen. Eleanor silently watched the television. The madness from earlier was gone from her eyes. Instead, they held deep exhaustion and resignation. "I'm sorry," she said, though it wasn't clear who her apology was directed to. Outside the window, several police cars were still standing by, and beyond the whitewood fence, neighbors stood watching the situation, smartphones in hand. Social media continued broadcasting this quiet, suburban tragedy to the world. The next morning, Greenwich was wrapped in unusual tension. At 6 a.m., before dawn, at the Brown residence, the kitchen, where perfect breakfast preparations would normally be underway, was dominated by an unnatural silence. Although Eleanor had woken at her usual time, she couldn't bring herself to get out of bed. Our top story today: the domestic violence incident against cooking YouTuber Catherine Brown. Eleanor caught her breath at the sight of herself on the TV screen. Her usually perfect hair, makeup, expression, everything looked maniacal. The live stream had recorded her rampage in detail. "Is that me?" Looking at her face in the mirror, Eleanor touched her cheek with trembling hands. She hadn't slept at all last night. Her memories were fragmentary. The boundary between reality and nightmare blurred. Then the doorbell rang. Mrs. Brown, ABC News. Could we discuss yesterday's incident? Eleanor, could you tell us about your 35 years as a DV victim? As reporters pressed in one after another, Eleanor's body began to shake slightly. It was the precursor to a panic attack. In the second-floor bedroom, Catherine woke to her smartphone's notification sound. Kathy's Kitchen had surpassed 100,000 subscribers overnight. The comment section was overflowing with words of encouragement, and messages of empathy from DV survivors were pouring in. We've had the same experience. Your courage has saved so many of us. Speaking up is the beginning of change. Catherine read through the comments while wiping away tears. Her arm burn was minor, and there was no concern for the baby's well-being. However, the emotional wounds wouldn't heal so easily. Meanwhile, David had shut himself in his home office. On his desk lay a mountain of documents from the police. His father George Brown's past was slowly coming to light. Multiple hospital emergency transport records, Eleanor's history of fractures, burns, bruises, all diagnoses recorded with obviously unnatural explanations like fell downstairs or iron accident. Why didn't I notice? David's hands trembled as childhood memories flooded back in fragments. Late night screams, his mother's crying, his father's roars. He had hidden under the bed, covering his ears. Since then, all this time, the police investigation had extended into George's past as well. The embezzlement at the pharmaceutical company, his history of alcoholism treatment, and the violence he had continued to inflict for years. The most shocking discovery was Eleanor's diary, found deep in the basement in an old trunk. It was a record of 35 years of suffering, written in perfect handwriting. The diary recorded an unimaginable history of violence hidden behind a facade of happiness. April 15th, 1989. Today again with the iron, but tomorrow is par day. I must get through it with a smile. December 24th, 1995. Christmas Eve, yet again in front of David. Can't let my son see. Must hide these wounds. Tomorrow I'll prepare a perfect dinner. January 10th, 2020. George collapsed. They say it's a heart attack. Is this the end? But the debts. David's face turned pale as he read through the diary. It contained truths he hadn't known, or perhaps hadn't wanted to know, recorded in detail. At 10 a.m., the police press conference began. This case appears to have a background of generational domestic violence regarding suspect Eleanor Brown, who is both victim and perpetrator. We plan to proceed with expert psychological evaluation. As camera flashes from reporters lit up the room, the chief investigator continued quietly. Simultaneously, we will investigate the 35-year history of domestic violence by the late George Brown. Additionally, this incident, visualized through social media, may lead to uncovering other potential domestic violence cases. These words would be reported across America. The incident in quiet suburban Greenwich had become a symbol, illuminating the deep darkness lurking in modern society. In the afternoon, a woman visited Catherine's hospital room. "Hello, I'm Sarah Johnson. I run a support group for DV survivors." A gentle, smiling middle-aged woman held a brochure in her hand. "We've seen many people like Eleanor, perpetrators who are also victims. If you're willing, would you share your experience with other victims?" Catherine nodded silently, then picked up her smartphone. The Kathy's Kitchen livestream was still saved on the screen. "If my experience can give someone hope," she whispered. Outside the window, spring sunlight poured down. Greenwich was going about its usual daily routine. However, from this day forward, something had definitely begun to change. A small but certain step toward breaking the cycle of violence was about to begin. 1 week after the incident, in the counseling room at Greenwich General Hospital, Eleanor quietly began to speak. My life has been 35 years of being forced to be perfect. Dr. Anderson, the therapist, listened silently, nodding as the afternoon sunlight through the window gently illuminated Eleanor's tired face. From the beginning of our marriage, George demanded perfection from me. Meals had to be served hot. The house had to be perfectly organized. That was the standard. Taking a shaky sip of water, Eleanor continued. The first violence came 3 months after our wedding. When I was late with the ironing and his shirt had wrinkles, he took the hot iron. Her words trailed off. The pain from 35 years ago seemed to still be etched in her body. But the next day, he went to work as if nothing had happened. He was the kind of man who received awards for charity work. I thought no one would believe me. Catherine and David watched this confession from the adjacent room through the one-way mirror. They observed Eleanor's figure. I never knew. David's voice trembled. Childhood memories now returned with new meaning. On nights when Dad came home late, Mom always waited with a hot meal ready. Even though she must have been tired, she wore a perfect smile. Catherine quietly took her husband's hand. The gesture seemed to ease some of David's tension. The counseling was bringing profound changes to all 3 of them. Eleanor had started attending DV, survivor group therapy meetings. Women with similar experiences gave her a new perspective. Maybe I never needed to be perfect, she said during one of the sessions. As she spoke these words, the tension that had long marked her expression was gradually fading. Meanwhile, Catherine had begun a new challenge on her YouTube channel. Today I'd like to talk about something different, she smiled gently at the camera. Her morning sickness had settled, and the little life inside her was growing steadily. Domestic violence isn't just an issue in certain families. If our experience can give someone hope. Kathy's Kitchen was gradually transforming into a channel that shared not just recipes, but also the family's healing process. Messages of empathy and encouragement from viewers never ceased. David, too, was making significant changes. I've decided to reduce my business trips, he announced at a family meeting one night. He had requested a transfer from research to management. I want to prioritize time with my family. I've been looking away for too long, but not anymore. Eleanor quietly shed tears at her son's decision. Then she turned to Catherine. I'm sorry for that day and for everything before. Catherine nodded gently at her heartfelt apology. Mom, let's build a new kind of family together. The 3 sat around the table, sharing a warm dinner, a real family scene, not striving for perfection, but embracing their true selves. Outside the window, the spring twilight gently enveloped the town. Greenwich's streets maintained their usual tranquility, but something had definitely changed in the Brown family. In the kitchen, there were no more demands for perfect meals or a tense atmosphere. Instead, there was growing trust, and new bonds were being nurtured. Eleanor now attended DV support, group meetings every Wednesday, sometimes sharing her own experiences. Catherine continued broadcasting, sharing easy recipes for expectant mothers and the family's recovery process. David was exploring a new family dynamic while reassessing his work-life balance. Shall we all cook dinner together today? Catherine asked. The family responded with smiles to her suggestion. Though a bit awkward, warm moments were beginning to flow. The cycle of violence was definitely breaking. A new kind of family was slowly but surely taking shape. One that didn't demand perfection, didn't hide wounds, and could ask for help when needed. The setting sun cast gentle light through the Brown family's windows. Its rays warmly blended the figures of the 3 people together. They weren't a perfect family, but that was okay. Healing wounds, deepening understanding, and moving forward step by step. This was the new path they had chosen.